Hello and welcome to Breaking Bread with Rivaj Maharaj, where nothing is off the table. For today's episode, I wanted to talk about the Kurds being prepared to launch an offensive into Iran from neighboring Iraq. So without further ado, let's get into it. Current reports coming out of Iraq, or rather the border regions between Iran and Iraq, are suggesting that the Kurds are preparing to launch an offensive into Iran. Now, I want to state right at the outset, this is something I've maintained all along, that in the absence of the United States actively putting boots on the ground, which I believe is a no-no. I don't think the United States populace have an appetite for another quagmire in the Middle East, and boots on the ground would certainly ensure that. However, given in light of recent events in Iran, namely Donald Trump using American military force to strike Karg Island's military installations, and the subsequent deployment of 5,000 US Marines to Iran, I suspect that those Marines will be deployed specifically to Karg Island to control and maintain the oil supply out of Iran. But for the broader war, and in order to effect regime change, aerial combat simply will not cut it. This indiscriminate bombing of Iranian targets will not solve the issue of regime change. For that, there is going to be a need for boots on the ground. Now, I've always maintained that the Kurds would be used as a proxy force for American boots on the ground.
This is one of many tunnel networks built by Pajak along the Iran-Iraq border, curved deep into the rock and linked across terrain. Thousands of Kurdish fighters along the border are waiting for 0 hour.
یا کمینه کو ام وکی فکری ایدئولوژی رحیده ام خو آماده بکن ذاتن حزمه حتمی حاضرن نکن بجن نه هیا دست بکیش گوتی حزمه کو در رجلات هیا آماده کردن پی بیست بک از جی بچمیزی
هنوز هیچ نوع سلاحی
So far, we have not received any weapons or logistical support from the US. We maintain some level of contact with the US government, but the actions of international coalitions, particularly the US, who abandoned the Syrian Kurds, have raised doubts and concerns among us.
And I've mentioned in previous videos about the relocation of those some 7,500 military-aged men that belonged to ISIS, that were prisoners of war being guarded by the Kurds in Syria, have now been relocated to Iraq. And that was done under the pretext of making sure that they still kept uh, in in captivity, for want of a better word. However, I suspect that their movement was more to ensure their presence in events as they unfolded in Iran. Now, I'll explain what I mean by this. If you recall, late last year, Abdullah Öcalan of the PKK had, to I think everybody's surprise, or to most people's surprise, declared that the PKK was going to disband and that they were in negotiations with the Turkish regime. And it looked like a huge win for Erdogan. However, you then had the Americans abandoning the Kurds in Syria, and the fallout from that was the escape of ISIS prisoners and their family members from Syrian detention facilities. Now, that sparks a whole different quagmire simply just for Europe alone, because the fallout from that escape is going to be felt in Europe for years to come. Those ISIS fighters that escaped are going to make their way back to Europe, and I have no doubt that Europe is now going to bear the brunt of this miscalculation in Syria. Needless to say, the Kurds are now very apprehensive about dealing with the United States. However, in out of chaos comes stability. Out of chaos comes opportunity. And as I mentioned in my video earlier on, I did say that if I were the Kurdish leaders, I would still go to the United States and say to them, look, you have a problem in Iran. Your populace are not willing for you to put boots on the ground in Iran. We prepared to go in on condition that we are given the part of Iran that legitimately belongs to the Kurdish people. So we will fight your proxy war, but we want to be given guarantees that that land will be ceded to us. And, this is something the Kurds have been fighting for time immemorial. Between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, there is disputed land that the Kurds are fighting for. Now, why I say this will lead to a huge quagmire is because, firstly, I want to say that the moment the Kurds cross into Iran, the entire dimension of this conflict changes. And this conflict then pivots increasingly towards a civil war. And the reason I say this is because the IRGC and the Basij are currently fighting for their survival. They are fighting for the survival of the current Iranian regime. So it is an existential threat. The Israelis fighting in Iran can always pivot back to Israel. The Americans fighting in Iran can always go back to the United States. The Iranians, that is the IRGC and the Basij, fighting in Iran are not only fighting for the existence of their current regime, but they are also fighting for their survival. Because should Iran collapse into chaos, or should the Iranian regime collapse, these IRGC and Basij fighters have nowhere else to go. This is their home. So for them, the fight is a do or die fight. Now, introducing the Kurds into this mix, it's like introducing oil and water. It's just not going to mix. They've never mixed for centuries. They're certainly not going to start now. And the Kurds have been oppressed by the Iranian regime in this region of Iran. So there is a lot of animosity, a lot of hatred, a lot of ill will between these two factions. And the Kurds, emboldened enough to go in because they sense weakness within the regime, is pitching Iran squarely in the crosshairs of a civil war. Now add to that mix a paranoid Erdogan sitting in Turkey. A man so paranoid that, the very thought of an emboldened Iranian Kurdish population, keeps him up at night. And seeing the United States rely on the Kurds going into Iran to help destabilize the regime, all sorts of ramifications start flooding Erdogan's paranoid mind. So you can imagine the pushback you're going to get from the Kurds. And this is why I say that those 7,500 ISIS fighters that were moved over from Syria into Iraq now become a useful tool in somebody's arsenal. Because don't forget, the Kurds kept these ISIS fighters in check. The ISIS fighters are proxies of the Turkish state and Erdogan and his family. So when destabilization begins to occur in Iran, Erdogan is going to unleash his ISIS fighters to help contain the Kurdish expansion. Because an emboldened Kurdish population in Iran does not bode well for Erdogan's regime in Turkey. Remember, there's something like 30 million Kurds living in Turkey who have been vociferously fighting for an autonomous Kurdistan within Turkey. The Kurdish identity has not been lost on these people. They are fighting, and they have been fighting since time immemorial for their right to their land. And I think now is as good a time as any for them to achieve that aim. One mustn't forget, Winston Churchill had a lot to say about the Kurds. And the British played a very important role in keeping the Kurds always subservient to the regional powers in that area. Very similar to what the British mindset was regarding the Indians in India. And Churchill's views of the Indians in India, that they were dastardly people, a beastly religion, and the famine in Bengal, when he was told about it, he just shrugged his shoulders. He couldn't be bothered, because a couple million Indians dying on the streets of Bengal of starvation, that was imposed on them by Churchill, was something that he was prepared to accept, because of course we are a dastardly people with a beastly religion, right? We don't deserve to live. And that is the same mentality that he and the British establishment at that time used to categorize the Kurds. So I think if there ever was a time for them to achieve an independent Kurdistan within at least Iraq, Iran, and Turkey for now, this is that opportunity. And this is why I say the Kurds moving into Iran is a pivotal turning point, or a change in direction of this war in Iran, because it does not bode well for the people of Iran. The fury that is going to be unleashed is going to be horrendous. This is now a civil war in the making. As I said in my previous video, the door, that handle to the door has been turned, the door has been cracked open. Now, the Kurds moving into Iran is going to blow that door off its hinges. Now, add to that mix the Pakistanis fighting an insurgency on their borders with the Taliban, with the BLA, as well as trying to maintain some semblance of authority along the border with India, because, you know, the Pakistanis always have this paranoia that they're going to wake up one morning and the Indians are going to be right at their doorstep. You know, the Indians are more than capable of doing that. Whether they want to do it or not is another issue, because personally I don't think it's a viable opportunity. Pakistan was lost a long time ago, and what has been bred in Pakistan since partition up until now is something no state in its rightful mind, in its sane mind, would want to inherit. Because if the people that created this basket case cannot contain what they have bred in that region, I don't see anybody else coming into that region and controlling this. You know, this is a country that has now embraced terrorism to unprecedented levels. So you've got the BLA who are continuously giving the Pakistani establishment nightmares. And you have a Baloch ethnic minority within Iran that were also being suppressed. So they would want to take advantage of this opportunity. Then you have the Azeris who are doing the bidding on behalf of the Israelis within Iran, and they would want to then assert some of their authority. So Iran is in a very, very vulnerable situation right now. The trouble is that the Iranian people are stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea. And by that I mean the devil is their current regime, and the deep blue sea is all the proxies sitting around the table that border Iran, waiting to manipulate the situation for their own gains and benefit. And again, I'm saying the Kurds moving into Iran is not going to bode well for the Iranian people, because it's going to unleash years years of turmoil. You know, I hope that the Iranian people can achieve some sort of normalcy as soon as possible and see some respite and hopes of a positive future, because they truly deserve it. You know, from the time of Islam conquering Persia, they have had nothing but pain, blood, and tears. And it just looks like that playbook is about to continue. So, you know, whilst the writing seems to be on the wall, I think we can all hope and pray for a better future for the Iranian people, because they honestly and truly do deserve it. I want to thank you for spending time with us. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe, as it helps us with the algorithm and it helps our channel to grow.